The following video contains scenes of police brutality and excessive force. Viewer discretion is advised. Police brutality is the scourge of the earth, gratuitous violence under the guise of order, a cursed existence for some doomed at birth. Fatal decisions means their lives are cut shorter. The cream of the crop, the finest in blue, make grievous decisions they can't undo. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome once again to my channel, Stop Effing Killing. I'm your host, the MOD, also known as the Method of Delivery. Before we get into today's topic, please like, share, and subscribe if you find anything that resonates with you. So, today's topic is police brutality, color of law, or lust for violence. Color of law or lust for violence. This will be a two-part series. So, before I go any further into the subject of police brutality, I want to wholeheartedly say that all law enforcement is not bad. All law enforcement is not bad. First and foremost, I don't know all law enforcement. I don't know every single law enforcement officer that works in this world. Secondly, I have personally been involved with law enforcement, and I can honestly say that there are some really good officers out there. Officers who are calm, officers who are fair and balanced, officers who are non-biased. However, I have also worked with officers who are criminals, officers who have raped, officers who have murdered or unalived people, officers who have robbed and did anything that a typical criminal would do. So I can once again honestly say that all law enforcement is not bad. Now, the thing about policing is police brutality is a worldwide problem. Being a police officer means that you will at some point use force. It could mean anything from physical presence up to and including lethal force. However, excessive force or unnecessary force is police brutality. According to Amnesty International, the UN countries are guided by principles that the United Nations, the UN, set out for them to govern themselves by, those UN countries. And this is according to Amnesty.org again, excuse me. So the first one is the UN basic principles on the use of force and firearms by law enforcement. Now, in summary, these are just guidelines for the use of force by law enforcement officers. And in this guidelines, they state that, officers are to take the nonviolent approach first before they resort to any type of physical violence. The second UN principle is the UN Code of Conduct for law enforcement officials. And basically what it says is that law enforcement has a responsibility to protect human rights. Self-explanatory. And the final principle, according to Amnesty.org, that the UN has laid out is the guideline for the use of less lethal weapons for law enforcement. Now, these less lethal weapons include tasers, batons, tear gas, things of that nature. And so finally, when we talk about, policing in the United States where I stay, the officers here are also guided by principles that are found in the Constitution, otherwise known as the amendments. Now, some of the main ones that stand out to me are, of course, the First Amendment, which is freedom of speech and freedom of press. So, can someone please tell me what is free about this police action?
see
That's a photographer.
what's going on now.
Member of the press.
Now there's just a lot of violence erupting. Ben, back up, back up.
Now, another standout amendment is the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment basically states that a person cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. So, if we take a brief look at the Slager shooting, then we will clearly see that the officer violated this deceased individual's Fifth Amendment rights. Let's take a look at it. And finally, we have the Eighth Amendment, which basically says that a subject cannot be cruel or unusually punished. Now, besides the amendments that are in the Constitution, many people in the United States feel that the modern police force gets its origins from the slave patrols. According to Gary Potter, who wrote the book, The History of Policing in the United States, these slave patrols served three main functions. The first function was to apprehend runaway slaves and return those slaves to their masters. The second function of these slave patrols was organized terror to deter revolts. Obviously, slaves were under extremely oppressive conditions, and many times they revolted. And so these slave patrols did everything they could to deter these revolts. And finally, the third function of these slave patrols, which were the modern precursor to today's police forces, is to maintain discipline for the slaves. Now, some of these slaves were subject to summary justice. In other words, they were tortured, beaten, and or unalived to show the other slaves that, hey, if you got out of line, this is what's going to happen to you, thereby maintaining discipline. Now, if we fast forward from the times of the slave patrols to the times of the late 1800s and early 1900s, we have several strikes that occurred in the United States, one of which was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Another one was the Pullman Strike of 1894. Then you have the Lawrence, Massachusetts Textile Strike of 1912, where Anna Lopezzo, and a female Italian immigrant, was killed, some say by police. And also you have the Hanapepe Massacre of 1924. Now, these weren't the only strikes that occurred in the United States. There were several strikes that occurred in the United States. However, the reason why I brought these strikes up is because these strikes and these individuals who were oppressed by the slave patrols, they had something in common. They were poor. They were minorities. They were powerless. They were people without a voice. And they were subject to organized and or government violence, also known as police brutality. And in some cases, some were tortured, beaten, and some were unalived. So we can go forward even more in history. When we go to 1991, we look at the Rodney King beating. Rodney King was mercilessly beat by law enforcement with batons on tape for several minutes. We can look at the Elijah McClain incident of 2019, where Elijah McClain, he didn't break the law. He violated no laws whatsoever. Yet, police intervention, to include a chokehold, and paramedic intervention cost him his life. George Floyd, 2020. Derek Chauvin knelt on George Floyd's neck in broad daylight in the middle of the street in front of multiple witnesses, cell phone cameras, CCTV, body-worn camera, to the point where George Floyd expired. And then we go to 2023, we have Tyre Nichols. Tyre Nichols, illegally stopped by law enforcement, beaten to death. So when we look at some of these incidents, again, as recently as 2023, minorities, powerless, voiceless. So where are we now, really? Are the police better trained? Have they had sensitivity classes and classes on racial profiling and, things of that nature? Do they have more tools to do their job, more technology to do their job? Are there more cameras, more surveillance? Is there just more to assist law enforcement in doing their job? Because as I just demonstrated, even with all of the surveillance and even with all of these extra tools that law enforcement now have that didn't exist in the past, they've still, many of them, chosen to brutalize citizenry. Now, I'm not saying any of these individuals who expired or who were beaten were perfect individuals. I'm not saying that, because there are no perfect individuals. But what I am saying is the use of force, just like in those slave patrols, just like in the strikes, just like in some of these incidents that are more recent, the force was excessive, the force was unnecessary. The thing is, no matter what, you cannot train away hate. You can't train away racism. You can't train away bigotry or class warfare. You cannot train those things away. You can't train away cowardice. You can't train away malice. So what can we do as citizens? Well, we're going to talk about that in part 2 of this series. Again, thank you for listening. Please take care of yourself and others. And remember, there is no you, there is no we. Me, there is only we. And we must stop the effing killing.